What would you think if I told you that a major fraud occurred on a national border, making it one of the most significant in modern history? Today, we'll unravel the controversial and intricate tale of Crimea, a story that's far from straightforward. This video will cover the historical background, the events leading to the annexation of Crimea, the international response, and the ongoing consequences. Over the course of several centuries, the Black Sea region was a battleground for dominance between the Ottoman Empire and the expanding Russian frontier, led by Peter I the Great in the late 17th century. This power struggle, which often erupted into open conflict, accumulated in a series of wars over the control of the Black Sea region. One of these wars, from 1768 to 1774, concluded with the signing of the treaty in 1774. This treaty saw Russia gaining control of fortresses on the Kerch Peninsula and establishing an autonomous Crimean Tatar state. In 1783, Catherine II the Great further solidified Russian influence by annexing the peninsula and incorporating it into Russian territory. Today, the main question is why Russia gave away Crimea to Ukraine. In 1954, the Soviet government transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federation of Socialist Republics, RSFSR, to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, UKSSR. This transfer was publicly announced 8 days after the USSR's Supreme Soviet Presidium authorized it, but no substantial information was provided at the time, and the rationale for the move remained vague. The official reasons were to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, symbolizing Russian-Ukrainian unity, and acknowledge Crimea's cultural and economic ties with Ukraine. However, these justifications were weak, as the treaty had no direct connection to Crimea, and the peninsula was more Russian than Ukrainian in its demographics and cultural ties. The transfer of Crimea from Russia to Ukraine in 1954 was not just a geopolitical maneuver, it was a decision with deep political motivations. Nikita Khrushchev, then the leader of the USSR, sought to consolidate his power and secure support from Ukrainian elites, such as Oleksiy Kyrillchenko, by expanding Ukraine's territory. The move also aligned with the Soviet strategy of reinforcing control over its republics by shifting populations, as seen in the Baltic states. Although the transfer followed the Soviet constitution, Moscow later used it to justify actions against Ukraine, illustrating how the decision, initially intended to strengthen Soviet control, has had lasting and ironic consequences. However, the first fraud that occurred after the annexation of the peninsula by the Russian Federation was the narrative that Crimea was always Russian and that the transfer was a gift. You see, the history of Crimea is a tumultuous tale of conquest, power struggles, and oppression. Less than 6% of Crimea's written history belongs to the Russian chapter, yet it has been a constant battleground for dominance by various powers. From its roots as a Greek land to the unique coexistence of different civilizations and empires, Crimea has witnessed the rise and fall of mighty forces. Russia's invasion in 1783 marked the beginning of a new era of opposition and forced displacement. The peninsula's demographics underwent a drastic change due to the expulsion of native populations and the imposition of Russian dominance. The suffering of the indigenous population, particularly the Crimean Tatars, at the hand of both Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union is a dark and harrowing chapter in Crimea's history. Contrary to popular belief, Crimea's transfer to Ukraine was not an act of generosity, but rather a strategic move. The peninsula's transfer aimed to address economic challenges, but did little to ease the turmoil that has plagued its people for centuries. Despite the complexities, the critical historical events that reshaped global politics happened a decade ago. In November 2013, Ukraine's move towards closer ties with the European Union was abruptly halted when President Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, canceled a planned association agreement with the EU. This led to widespread protests in Kiev, with figures such as Lutsenko and Klitschko leading massive demonstrations. The situation escalated as police violently dispersed protesters in Independence Square, sparking further unrest. As the protests grew, Russia offered economic aid to Ukraine, but Yanukovych responded to escalating violence by passing laws restricting protests. This led to even larger demonstrations, and clashes between protesters and police resulted in injuries and deaths. By January 2014, the unrest spread to eastern Ukraine, which was traditionally a Yanukovych stronghold. The government attempted to ease tensions by repealing anti-protest laws and releasing jailed protesters, but the violence persisted. In February 2014, government forces killed dozens of protesters, leading to EU sanctions against Ukraine. Opposition forces began to seize government buildings in western Ukraine. The crisis culminated in an EU-brokered agreement calling for early elections and a reduction of presidential powers. Yanukovych fled Kiev as his power base collapsed, and opposition leader Tymoshenko was released from prison. An interim government was established, with early elections scheduled for May 2014. Yanukovych resurfaced in Russia, claiming he was still the rightful president. The primary fraud, however, occurred in 2014 when Russian forces occupied the peninsula. First was the incident with the Little Green Men. After Yanukovych was removed from power, the leader of a large paramilitary group in Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, asked Putin for help. Putin decided to act because many people in Crimea supported ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. Pro-Russian protesters in Crimea called the government in Kiev Western fascists and said that ethnic Russians in Ukraine were in danger. Unidentified armed groups started appearing in the region, often working with local pro-Russian militias. The Ukrainian government and most Western intelligence sources said that the Little Green Men who showed up in Crimea were Russian operatives. The Crimean self-defense militias took control of government buildings, air bases, and military installations. As Russian forces took control of key facilities in Crimea, including airports, Russia continued its denials. However, following a controversial March 16th referendum that led to Crimea's annexation, Putin gradually acknowledged that Russian troops had been involved. In March 2015 documentary, Putin openly admitted that Russian soldiers were deployed to Crimea under his orders to ensure a smooth annexation, citing the need to protect the local population from alleged threats by Ukrainian nationalists. Despite previous denials, Putin stated that Russian forces were present to maintain security and facilitate the annexation process, which he justified as necessary to avoid conflict and allow Crimea to join Russia peacefully. Oh, did I mention a controversial referendum? In reality, it was nothing but a fraud. The official Crimean election results showed a 97% vote in favor of annexation, with a reported turnout of 83%. However, a report from the president of Russia's Council on Civil Society and Human Rights suggested that the turnout was only 30%, with only 15% of Crimean citizens voting for annexation. This contradicts the official Kremlin results and raises questions about the legitimacy of the referendum. And let's be honest, it's tough not to vote as you are supposed to when there are literally armed soldiers in the election districts. The annexation was predictably met with international disapproval and resulted in sanctions from the European Union, the United States, and other countries. Regarding the United Nations position on the annexation, the General Assembly passed a resolution affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity and acknowledging Crimea as part of Ukraine. And of course, such a brazen violation of the international law has far-reaching implications. On February 24, 2022, Russia waged a full-scale war against Ukraine. Following the invasion, Vladimir Putin signed accession treaties just a few months later, officially solidifying Russia's unlawful annexation of 4 occupied regions in Ukraine. This action marked the most significant forcible seizure of territory in Europe since the Second World War. The annexation has placed a significant strain on Russia's relations with Western nations. Ukraine has received more than $380 billion in aid from primarily Western countries since January 2022, which has enabled the country to continue its resistance. Countries across the globe have pledged almost $118 billion in direct military support to Ukraine, along with financial and humanitarian assistance. According to information from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, as of January 15, 2024, over 40% of this aid originates from the United States. However, the problem is that there's no real end to this conflict. Why? On one hand, as long as Putin feels the power, he will highly likely continue his military campaign. On the other hand, one could argue that NATO is helping Ukraine to fight but not to win, as the West continues to impose restrictions on the use of the arms provided to Ukraine. Although the annexation of Crimea represents a complex and highly contested event in modern history with far-reaching consequences, we should not neglect those consequences. If countries like Russia are allowed to annex sovereign territories, the world becomes a much more dangerous place, where any dictator with enough military strength could start a war of his own, leaving the world in chaos and destruction.